Welcome back, friends. Another week of tournaments in the book, and I got all the data here for you. In this video, we're going to go through the tournament results from the previous week. We're going to swap things up a little bit this week, and we're going to look at the overall current state of the meta next, and I'm going to add a little bit more data in there. And at the end, we're going to do the faction focus. We're going to take a deeper dive on Thousand Suns and Chaos Space Marines. So sit back, relax, and let's get to it. Before we get started, we'll do the quick YouTube pleasantries. If you liked this video or found it helpful and informative, please give it a like. It really helps spread it out there for more people to see. And if you really liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It really helps support me and support the channel. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. First thing, we're going to look at the number of players for the previous week and for the current data slate. So last week, we had just over 600 players, and for the data slate, we have just over 4,600. Games played was just over 3,300, and for the data slate, we're sitting at over 24,000. And we had 10 tournaments last week, bringing our total for the data slate up to 76. All right, and the first chart we're going to look at is the win percentages by army for the previous week. So, sitting at the top, we have Necrons at 57%, Thousand Suns 55%, Drukhari 54%, and then we have Orcs and Deathwatch at 53%, rounding out the top 5. Thousand Suns had a pretty good week at 55%. They've been kind of struggling since the last data slate, under 50% for the most part, so it was nice to see them sort of bump back up there. They've been kind of a little bit of a boogeyman for a lot of this edition, but they've been taking a hit lately, so, you know, a little success here and there is never too bad. Necrons had a strong showing. 57%. They're always up at the top, remaining one of the best armies to play right now. And down at the bottom, Imperial Agents, 33%, we're just going to ignore them. Dark Angels, 39%, still struggling quite a bit. Things aren't getting much better there. At third worst, we have Eldari with 41%. I have a feeling that's going to go up a little bit when the new Codex releases here next week. Black Templars, 41%, and Chaos Space Marines at 42%. That's the bottom 4. So overall, it wasn't terrible. There's more armies that struggled than you'd like to see, but there wasn't any armies that really ran away with anything. So overall, a decent week for results. Next, we're going to look at the army representation. So this is the percentage of people who play each army. So the average, if everyone played everything evenly, would be about 3.7%. At the top, we have Space Marines at 7.7%. That's like 2 times as much as the average. Not surprising to see. They're winning a lot of tournaments. They've got a pretty good win rate. They're, the most popular army, so not surprising to see them up there. Chaos Demons and Asher Militarum both at 6.6 and 6.3 respectively, next in line. Demons are riding high on the Legion of Excess, so they got a high representation, and Guard are always very popular. Imperial Knights, surprisingly to see, 6.1%. They're not usually that high. They are a popular army, but it's surprising to see them up that high. And then Blood Angels at 6% is always another popular choice. Down at the bottom, we got Imperial Agents, 0.2%. Again, it's not out of the ordinary. They only had 2 or 3 players last week. Next up, we had Deathwatch, Drukhari, and Space Wolves all at 1.3%, and Black Templar at 1.6%, rounding out the bottom. So like this whole data slate, this previous week kind of represents how everyone's kind of playing things. Most of the players are in 10 armies, and then you have the ones who aren't seeing much success down way below average. So people are kind of, you have your diehards who play armies because they love them, but anyone who has multiple armies or is trying to win tends to swap from those armies at the bottom to the ones that are having a little bit more success. So we're kind of seeing a gradual shift into higher percentages into the top and very low percentages in the bottom. Another weird thing to note, Orcs at 2.9% underrepresentation. That doesn't happen too often. They're usually a very popular army, so I don't know what caused that this week, but they had good results for the week, but a low representation. Just something to note there. All right, and next up is the percentage of players who went XO or X1 at a tournament. So this is players who had no losses or only 1 loss at a tournament. It's just a good way to measure how successful the actual faction is. Win percentage is nice to see, but this shows you the amount of people who actually did really well at a tournament. So the higher the number, the more players that did well at tournaments. And we can look at the top here, and we got Orcs and Necrons, both over 33%. So that was actually very surprising. And if you go back to the previous slide, you can see Orcs, I mentioned, they only had 2.9% rep. They had a lower than average representation, but a third of their players did really well at tournaments. You're only losing once and not losing at all. So they're definitely finding a lot of success there. And Necrons, they always have a fairly decent representation, over 5%, also had a lot of success. So that army is sitting in a really good spot. They're winning a lot of games, and people are doing really, really well with them. Down at the bottom, we have 4 armies that had 0. So Mechanicus, Deathwatch, Genestealers, and Agents all had 0% in this. So no one who brought any of those armies saw any success. Maybe they went 3-2 or 2-3, but no one was getting anywhere close to winning a tournament with those armies. So this is kind of a description of have and have-nots. You've got a few armies at the top doing really well, and you got a bunch of armies at the bottom doing really poorly. Okay, and now we're going to move on to the chart that sort of puts all these numbers together to give a good representation of how an army is actually doing. So the blue is the win rate, XOX1 is green, and army representation is purple. So if you look at the top here, you can see Necrons, Thousand Suns, Drukhari, and Deathwatch. It's filtered by win percentage, but if you look at how far the bar goes across, you can see Necrons, theirs stretches the far across. So they have the highest average across all the different metrics, and most of that is made up because of their extremely high XOX1. And you can see Orcs is second in line there, and that's also because they're XOX1. So you can see where factions are maybe getting a lot of win percentage, like say Deathwatch, 53%, but their XOX1 is 0. So they just had a bunch of players going 3-2, 2-3, and what have you. No one really doing it very well or finding any success or getting anywhere close to winning a tournament with them. And then you look at Orcs, and it's like, okay, they had 2.9% of the representation. They had an average win rate, 53, same as Deathwatch, but their XOX1 was 33%. So they had a bunch of people doing really, really well. So there's definitely a lot more play with the Orcs last week than there was with Deathwatch. And then you look at the bottom, and Agents, they're the smallest category because they had the super low rep. They had no XOX1. But you have Dark Angels, less than 40% win rate. They only had a 4.5% XOX1 and a 3.5% rep. So the rep was actually fairly average. So there was a decent amount of Dark Angel players. But again, not many of them were having much success. They were just sort of mid-board players and probably bottom-board players, to be honest, with the way their win percentage was going. Black Templars, next in line, 41% win rate. But they had 20% XOX1 and a 1.6% rep. So overall, most players struggle with Black Templars, but there was 1 or 2 players who did have some success there. And Eldari is next in line there, 41, 7.7, and 2.1. I have a feeling those numbers are going to shoot up quite a bit once the new codex releases. I think everyone's just kind of moving away from it now, not really too into Eldari, because it's kind of hard to get hyped to play a game with them when you have a new codex coming out. Everything's going to change next week. But overall, most armies are sort of in line there. You can look at the end of the bars. Most of them fall within a very close range. There's just a few outliers sticking way out and a few outliers going way back. But overall, everything is looking pretty decent with a few outliers here and there. All right, next up is the tournament wins for each army last week. So at the top, we had Tyranids with 2, Space Marines and Blood Angels also with 2, and then we had Necrons, Knights, Drukhari, and Guard all with 1. Tyranids starting to win some tournaments. They hadn't won any for the first 5 weeks, and now they've won in the last 2 weeks in a row, so that's good to see. Space Marines keep winning every week, not surprising. And Blood Angels, they haven't won a ton of tournaments either, so it's nice to see them pull out a couple there. And Knights also got a tournament win, which is good to see. They don't always win a lot either. All right, and now we're going to move on to the win percentage by army for the current data slate. So this is going all the way back to December 16th. So at the top, we can see Deathwatch with 54%, Necrons 53%, Demons 52%, Drukhari at 51%, and Tyranids at 51%. That rounds out the top 5. And at the bottom, you have Templars with 43%, Knights with 43.6%, Mechanicus with 44%, and Sisters with 45%. And then Leagues of Votann with just over 45%, rounding out the bottom 5. Overall, you want to be, GW sort of measures their balance within that 45 to 55% win rate, and those are the ones in the green. Overall, most armies fall within that win rate. A few armies are struggling. Chaos Knights, Templars are still having a pretty rough go of it. So hopefully with the next data slate, they can fix those Grotmas Detachments and give them a little bit of love and sort of get them back up to where they need to be. I know Sisters players are in a bad spot as well. I'm looking at the comments and videos, and people are, pretty down on Sisters right now, and, rightly so. They're in a really rough spot. So hopefully they can bring back some of that flavor to Sisters and give them a little bit more to play with, and make them a little bit more competitive. Not maybe to where they were before. That was a little excessive, but there's definitely some work to be done, a middle ground to be reached. Same as Votann. They're barely in that percentage win rate you want to be at, but the fan base and the player base in the comments and from what I'm seeing around is, pretty dejected. They're definitely hoping for some improvements and give them a little more flavor and make them a little more fun. Okay, and we're going to look at the representation for the current data slate. So you can see Space Marines at 8%. That's over 2 times the average. So that's pretty high for 7-week totals. Necrons also at 6.8%, which is also very high. Guard at 5.9, Custodies at 5.7, and Tyranids at 5.5. So that rounds out the top 5. And at the bottom, you have Imperial Agents, Deathwatch at 1.3, Sisters at 1.6, Drukhari 1.7, and Space Wolves at 1.8. Necrons and Guard both having pretty high rep. I suspect Guard might sort of creep up a little bit more next coming weeks due to their codex coming out. And I also think that you'll see Eldari jump up quite a bit once their codex drops, and people are pretty hyped for that one. But a majority of the players are leaning into the top 10 there. Anywhere from Orcs and up, 4.7% and up. That's kind of like a majority of the players. And there's quite a few armies who are really struggling. So it looks like, you have the diehards for this data slate who are sticking with their armies and playing them. And then you have the ones who are kind of going into the ones who have a chance to win. Like, if you're winning most of your tournaments with Demons and Space Marines and Necrons, you're going to have the highest player base. And especially with Space Marines, who always have a higher player base. So you'd like to see the army representation sort of skewed back down a little bit and sort of balanced, because you have that win rate balance, but you don't have the rep balance. So that means that there's something in the power of each army which, with skilled and experienced players, can pull out those tournament wins. And that's where you're kind of seeing the spike at the top and the decline at the bottom. And you'll notice that in the next slide when we go to the tournament wins for each army. And this chart shows it week by week. So each color is actually a different week since the last data slate. And based on what I'm saying in the previous slide, if you look at the armies who have high representation and the armies who won a lot of tournaments, there are kind of a lot of overlaps. Space Marines with 11, Necrons with 7, Demons with 7, Orcs with 6, and then you have Astra Militarum with 5. So the top 5 in rep are very close to the top 5 in tournament wins, and the bottom ones in rep are close to the bottom ones with no tournament wins at all. Down the bottom, you have Mechanicus, Templars, Agents, Votan, and Sisters. It's a very mirroring of the representation, and it's a good indication that players are playing the armies that win. Players want to win, and they want to do good, and the people who love an army and just play an army to play an army because that's their army, they'll stick with it, but you're not going to see a bunch of tournament wins come from those armies. Overall, this is not what you want to see. You don't want to see 4 or 5 armies winning every time. You want to have, you don't want to be a Knights or Sisters or Votan player or even Death Guard and be like, well, I'm probably not going to win unless you're one of the top players in the world who knows you're going to win. Like, you want that chance that if you do play well and you do play right and you optimize and do everything you can, that you do have a chance to win. And it's looking like that's really not the case. Hopefully they can take some of those combos or some of those abilities that are just giving those other armies the edge to win and sort of tone them down a little bit and sort of give something back to those armies who are struggling, so you can maintain a good win percentage, but sort of balance out that XOX1, balance out those tournament wins, and then hopefully that will result in a balancing out of representation. Because even last data slate, when Gene Stealer Cults was winning everything and they were winning all kinds of tournaments and their win percentage was super high, their rep was over 4 or 5% some weeks, and that's like, and even higher than that, and that's unheard of for Gene Stealers because they're a very expensive army to play, they're a very difficult army to paint, and they're a difficult army to play. And if they're up that high in representation, they're overpowered. People will play what wins, and you want every army to have a chance to win, so you can hopefully have everyone playing every army. Okay, and we're going to move on to the faction focus for the week. The first one up is Thousand Sons. So we take a look at the win rates and the army rep since for the last 8 weeks, and since the last data slate, their win percentage is struggling pretty hard in the 40s and one time in the 30s for the whole time. Last week was the first week they had 55%, over 50%, so that's good to see, even though their army rep was down, and maybe that could be indicative that the few people who are sticking with them are those elite players, the players who know how to get the most of them, and they're doing well. Be curious to see if their win percentage would be still that high if they had a higher rep. But they still had a good week overall. If you look at the sub-factions, clearly their Grotmas Detachment, the Hexwarp Thrallband, was a huge miss. Only like 1% of people even brought it to a tournament, and it only had a 40% win rate. I mean, Cult of Magic's not doing that much better with 47, but clearly no one really cares for the Hexwarp Thrallband. And quickly looking at the ranks, their bottom ranks pretty much everything except XOX1 percentage, so that's actually 4th. So, you know, you got, they're in the low 20s for all the players, games played. Their win percentages, tournament wins, they've only won 2, but they are having some success. So there is some players who stuck with them through the nerfs, and they're still finding ways to win, but overall, it's only a few players who are kind of propping this up right now, I think. Moving on, we have the Chaos Space Marines faction focus. So first thing we're going to look at is the Army Rep and Win results for the last 8 weeks. Overall, it's been kind of mid. They're like mid to high 40s, and the representation is always high because they're a very popular faction. They've been around forever, one of the staples of the setting, so they're always a high representation, but the win percentage has been kind of meh. But if you look at the sub-factions, Creations of Bile, the Grotmas Detachment, big success. 40% of the players are taking it, so whatever they did with that definitely was a big hit with players. They're having a lot of fun playing it. Now, that fun's not necessarily translating to wins. You know, 46% win rate, it's okay. It's right in line with the rest of the army, so nothing great. There's a couple sub-factions who are getting a good win percentage, even though they have a very low representation. Chaos Cult, only 3% of people are playing it, but has a 63% win rate. And Deceptors, only 2% of people are playing it, but they have a 59% win rate. So looks like there's a few people finding success with those ones, but overall, they're just kind of doing okay. If you look at the meta health rating, they're 107 out of 100, so they are about as balanced and average as you can get. Their win percentage is just below average, their army reps above average, their XOX1 is just a little bit below, and their tournament wins are a little bit higher. So overall, this army's in a pretty okay spot. Nothing too concerning. They could maybe use a little bit of love, but you don't want to overdo it because that can quickly snowball into something really powerful. But, you know, Chaos Space Marines, well, they're not flashy and they're not, you know, winning all the tournaments or dominating with the scariest units in the game. They're doing fairly well. So that's not, you know, this is kind of where you want to be. So it's not bad to see. Okay, guys, and that's it for this week. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps support me. Gets the video out there for more people to see. If you really liked it, don't forget to subscribe so you get all the latest videos when I post them. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it, and I'll see you next week.